Oh, it helps if I click the button. Shush. Damn it. Start it over. All right.
Can we keep that in the recording?
All right, try again.
I'm a beast stalker, giant stalker, dragon stalker, crypt stalker, demon stalker, rift stalker, grom stalker, crypt stalker, scourge stalker, wind runner. I'm a bone elite skill hunter, a death dealer, a life stealer. That's just because to be an awesome.
Welcome to episode 232 of the Hunting Party Podcast. I'm Dark Brew from thebrewhall.com and the Brew Hall on Twitter.
And I'm Delirium from Thrill of the Wild and at Delirium Hunts on Twitter.
Today is Sunday, January the 24th, 2016, and we are broadcasting live on twitch.tv. You can participate in the live chat room where our lovely moderator, Ali Saunders, is there to take your questions. And we've got a great show today. Joining us this week, special guest is V, also known as Zoopercat from Ask Mr. Robot. And she's here to talk about a couple of articles that she's written for Blizzard Watch, a couple great topics. But for those who don't know, V started raiding in vanilla with her coworkers at Xfire as a hunter, yay, but switched to a healing druid shortly after, boo. Although we do like to be healed. We don't really care who heals us, right? Because we stand in all sorts of stuff. So we love our healers. And these days, she spends most of her time researching gear, stats, and combat data as part of the three-person Ask Mr. Robot team. So, V, welcome back to the Hunting Party Podcast.
Yay.
Not your first visit here, so we're happy to have you as always.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited. This is
Cool.
going to be a fun show.
Cool. All right. Well, before we start talking about those articles you wrote, Delirium, you had an announcement you wanted to mention.
Oh, right. For anybody who's interested, friend of the show, Brutal, also known as Brutal Static, is currently streaming every single raid from World of Warcraft this weekend. I think he started to try to do it in one day, but it spilled over to today. So if you want to check that out, he's at twitch.tv/brutalstatic.
Good deal. So, all right. Well, we're just going to focus on what you had to write. The two articles you wrote, by the way, were at Blizzard Watch. One was called How Cookie Cutter Builds Discourage Player Customization, and then I believe the second one was How Cookie Cutter Builds Can Encourage Negative Player Behavior. And so why don't we dive into that and tell us a little bit about what they were about and kind of what made you decide to go ahead and write about those particular topics.
Yeah. So we, doing what we do, we get a lot of questions from people on what, gear they should use, what trinket they should use, talents and things like that. And, we're experts in data and, analyzing it and figuring out, the right statistical methods to analyze things. We're not necessarily experts in every single spec, right? There's 3 of us. So, and 33 specs, that would be a lot of work. So, we started looking into some of this and we've noticed that a lot of people have very strong opinions about certain things like talents that absolutely need to be picked or trinkets that there's only, one right trinket to use. And when we model these and research them, we find no, a lot of these cases, they're very similar, like talent A and talent B. It's like, well, one's 1% worse. That doesn't mean you can never use it, right? And, so we would tell people these things and we would just butt up against a whole lot of resistance for that. And so we would try to research this and we're like, well, are we missing something, right? Maybe there's a different spell rotation that would make our research invalid. And no, we couldn't find anything like that. We'd work with the theory crafters. It really did just turn out that a lot of these talents and trinkets are actually very well balanced. So we started to look into this, and then we did a talk at BlizzCon, the day before BlizzCon when we did the parties. And Eric and Peter, who do a lot of our theory crafting, kind of looked at this, right? And they talked with a lot of people who showed up to this talk about what's really happening here, right? And the problem is that it's not that there's one talent is 1% better and people want to choose that, that's fine. Knock yourself out. Of course, you know, if you want to optimize, go for it. The problem occurs when people feel like they're forced to choose those talents, right? And they're like, but I don't want to use that talent. Or maybe it's not that I just don't want to, but I figured out this one on my own and I like this rotation, which requires this talent. And a lot of people are kind of getting forced into switching to what is popular. So we decided to get a little more scientific about this, and I put together a survey. And with the survey, well, one of my theories was that if we gave people this data, right, would that change people's opinions compared to what they're reading on guides or what the top players are doing? So in the survey, I asked everyone the same question. I laid out that there's a Fury Warrior on a raid team, and he's doing less damage than the team thinks that he should be doing. And he's using the Fury Strikes talent, which is the not popular talent, because he thinks it's fun. And then I inserted a randomly selected statement. And so a lot of you can see that. Okay, so a lot of you can see those statements. Great. So you can read through those, and the data statement gave the data I was talking about. The guide statement just picked up on what guides were saying, and then the top player statement was based on log data from what the top players are doing. So from there, we found out when people were shown the data statement, and then, sorry, back on the question, as you could see from the stream here, we finally asked, is it acceptable for the Fury Warrior to continue to use Furious Strikes, which is the less popular talent? So when shown the data statement, 80% of the people said, yeah, he can keep it. 20% still said no. So of course I was curious, like, why do those 20% say no, right? I just proved to you they're close. And then people who saw the guide statement, it was about a 50-50 split. And then the top player statement was about 50-50 split, but slightly favoring the yes side. So it's 55-45. And I think a lot of that from the responses I read came from people like, well, just because the top players do it doesn't mean I have to, right? So what ended up being the most interesting is after I asked that question, is it acceptable for the Fury Warrior to continue to use his talent? I just asked why, an open-ended question, and I had to read through about 2,000 to 3,000 responses. Kicked myself for that, but it was great.
Well, it's always good to get more feedback than less,
Right, because you can always ignore it if it's too overwhelming or it didn't turn out to be what you wanted. Exactly. So I kind of found 5 categories, and so I started categorizing all of the responses. And when people said, the answer to why, some people said, you know what, it's fun. He finds it fun, let him play it. Some people alluded to skill, right? So they were saying, well, skill's probably the bigger factor than a one talent choice. Some people referenced that they're balanced, so who cares? A bunch of people referenced team, and now what's interesting is normally when you say, oh, something's good for the team, you think this is a nice positive, everyone likes teams. But most of them, about 75% of the team responses were actually really negative, like, this person's just being selfish and, those kinds of things, right?
Right.
Like, you have to do what's best for the team. And then the last category was logic. And so these are people who, have a technical understanding of the class and were, reasoning why one talent was better over the other. So this team statement was really, really popped out for me. So when people said yes, I have to scroll down here, look at the next picture. Let's see. And so in the data statement, well, let me step back. When looking at the guide and top player statements, those actually were about even across everything. So when people were shown that and they said, oh, well, you have to switch talents to the one you don't like, about 40% of the people recited team as the reason, right? So they were like, well, you have to switch because it's what's best for the team. And usually a slightly more rude manner. These are the people who are kind of like bullying, your average player into, having to switch, or they feel stupid, right? Like, oh, they make me feel dumb for not knowing that that's the best talent. So that's kind of this toxic behavior. So that was about 40% of the people. But then when people were shown the data statement, only about 10% of the people cited this negative team thing as the reason. So we just shrunk this toxic attitude from 40% to 10% just by showing them the actual data behind the talents. So that was really interesting. And then the other thing that really stood out for me is this logic category. So people who were shown the guide and top player statements, tried to explain nicely, right? They were like, well, here's why this talent is actually better. This is why the guides are recommending it. This is why the top players are choosing it. And good for them, right? They've read some guides, they've figured this out, and they're trying to be somewhat helpful. But what's interesting, when I showed them the data statement, nearly every single logic response was negative instead of being positive. They were basically like, well, your simulations are wrong. Why do you think my simulations are wrong? Right? And I feel like we're a respectable, source for theory crafting. And if they think, Ask Mr. Robot, who builds these insane algorithms, did bad simulations, what do you think average Joe who says, hey, I used a simulator to figure out that this talent's best for me, what do you think he's going to get as a response, right?
Right, or what are they using too? I mean, are not all the top players do their own theory crafting.
Right.
There's they rely off your information and SimCraft and things like that. So
yeah, so I kind of looked at that as like this where you believe in something so much that when somebody shows you different data, you just dig your heels in deeper, right? So anyway, so those are kind of the two interesting things I think came out of it, which is where I started looking at like guides, tools, and websites, and I'm not blaming guide writers. Like, we love guide writers. They do a lot of work. We, Ask Mr. Robot, are also part of this problem. We show, we might have 4 different sets of stat weights for a Beastmaster Hunter. I should actually probably look that up and know how many we have since I'm on your show. But we do have one as the default, right? And because we, Ask Mr. Robot, suggest that as the default, we're basically saying, without meaning to, we think that's your best choice, right? So we're also participating in this problem of giving these opinions without necessarily telling you why or giving you the math behind it. So I think it's something that all of us can pay attention to and learn from this lesson. And together, all of us, whether you're a tool maker, a simulator, or a guide writer, we can all kind of come together and figure out how to change this.
Right, so you mentioned in one of your articles, or maybe in a comment, I can't remember where, but you're talking about something, a trinket maybe, where somebody from Blizzard actually wrote you and said, hey, why aren't you guys recommending this? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, yeah. So it's actually interesting. So when I did the survey, I did it also on the Moonkin trinket. There's a lot of controversy on the Moonkin trinkets. But I made a mistake in the question where I wasn't 100% clear. I said something like, this trinket is better than this one, and here's why. But when I explained why, I was explaining why the other one was worse, not why the first one was better. And because of the slight language choice, I could have confused people on which one I was trying to justify, right? So I didn't end up using that in the final articles. But yeah, one of the Blizzard people was asking us and said, hey, why don't you recommend, I forget the trinket that it is, but I think it's like a tanking trinket that gives you like versatility or some stat, like a whole bunch of tertiary stats or something like that. And we're like, look, we really want to, right? We think it's great. However, pretty much the entire theory crafting community hates those tertiary stats and doesn't value them. And so we used to recommend it, and almost all of the time we hold our ground on what we recommend if people disagree with us, unless somebody comes along and gives us a very, very good explanation and maths it out, right? Then we change it. But in like 2 cases, we've decided, okay, you know what? Fine. We're going to change this and we're going to drop the weight on these trinkets because the entire community hates them across the board. So sometimes, even we have to, conform to this. Otherwise, I just spend every day and every hour on every single forum justifying it on deaf ears, right? And so, yeah, even Blizzard was like, we really think this is a great trinket. I'm like, well, it's not that the trinket's the problem, it's the tertiary stats that nobody seems to care about. So I don't know how you guys feel as hunters with all that stuff. But I know like a lot of the tanks and DPS community, as far as I can tell, really just don't like those stats.
Yeah,
I'd say that probably applies to hunters as well. I mean, they're you don't see them. It's not, you don't find them on enough gear consistently, I guess, that that it really feel like they're worthwhile.
Yeah, so it's like the Kazakh trinket.
Yes,
that's the one that has a bunch of tertiary stats, like 500
that might be
each
the
or
one.
something.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an agility version of that for hunters if we wanted. Yeah, and so I think the common argument is anything those tertiary stats are going to save me from, I could just play better. You know,
Sure,
so speed is
Mm-hmm.
going to keep me alive. Perhaps it's going to get me out of the puddle. Well, if I would have just thought ahead and played better, I could have fixed that. And to some extent, that's not true with the, if I don't have enough crit, I can't play marksmanship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or it's really boring and slow to play at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whereas like Leech for healers, I do really like. But yeah, I think like Leech is much better built into the healing thing than movement speed is for DPS.
Oh, there was some, it wasn't called Leech at the time, but in Siege of Orgrimmar, I can't remember the name of the boss, the big mechanical guy, he dropped something with what essentially was Leech, and it was an amazing soloing trinket for hunters. If you wanted to solo MOP stuff, like that was just an awesome trinket for getting just crazy amounts of healing. But yeah, in an actual raid, I don't think anybody would recommend it for a DPS.
Right, and the Kazakh trinket too is the same way. It's great to have if you're like running through ICC or someplace and you want to get around, move around a little bit faster. That the speed is actually useful in that situation because you're way overpowered, relative to everything else you're doing. So you don't need the added DPS you might get from your other trinkets.
Right, because you're already one-shotting everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I did see Hamlet, who's not a Hunter theory crafter, but pretty prominent name, I think, in the theory crafting community in general, was once arguing in favor of whatever the speed tertiaries. And his basic argument seemed to be that if it keeps you alive, you're going to do more DPS when you're alive than dead, or more HPS, I think, in his case. And yeah, it's just really hard to wrap your head around that as like a reasonable choice. I'm not sure. I mean, that's certainly something you hear people say a lot, that you can't DPS while you're dead.
Right.
Yep. You know how many times I have to argue that? And that actually came up in this survey too. Like you might be arguing over this 1% talent choice. And they're like, yeah, but that 1%, what if you got the boss down to 1% and you wipe? It's like, okay, did anybody die? Because that's your first problem, right? Not this person's talent choice. Now, if everybody's living and everybody's fully flasked up and you're consistently getting to 1%, okay, you can make that argument. But that's not happening. We all know when you get to 1%, half the raid is dead.
Right. Well, when you start, and it was interesting to see that when people were presented with data, they were more, they sort of became more reasonable, if you will, in sort of understanding. I mean, what point do you start to, how big of a gap in terms of, say, when we're talking about DPS between, say, one talent and another, how far off percentage-wise does it need to be before it really becomes obvious, I guess, that, hey, this is a superior choice and really becomes the only choice?
And that's a very good question. I feel like most people would agree, 1%, it doesn't matter. 5%, I think you're going to start getting maybe like a break point where some people are like, well, now we're starting to care. In the survey responses, people who talked about percentages, I saw 5 and 10 thrown around a lot. I feel like a lot of people might be like 10%, that's huge, right? And then I did have one person on the extreme who said, hey, as long as they're doing more DPS than the healer, let him do what he wants. Which I thought was
then a
generous.
Healer. Yeah. Wow.
It's like that's pretty generous right there. You should
I want
see.
that raid leader.
Right? And I wonder if it really just comes down to trying to show the differences in general, like as a guide writer or if we're doing showing simulation results, should we just show the difference between all of them? It's like, well, here's a talent row. There's 3 talents. This one does the most, this one's 1% less, and this one's 10% less, and then people can make that decision for themselves. Because if I know, I might really like this talent a lot better. But if I know that it does 10% less, all right, I'm gonna try the other ones, give it a shot, right, and see if I can make it work. And then people who do switch talents, you can try to start to figure out, like, did your DPS go up? Instead of 1%, did it actually go up 8%? Well, why is that? Did that talent maybe fit into your rotation better? So you can kind of start to just use all this data to really help yourself improve, I think.
Yeah, so that kind of brings up something I found interesting. I was trying to think how it applied to hunters is the enjoying playing it. I have no idea what Furious Strikes is. I have no idea how Fury Warriors work. That means nothing to me.
You know what? I'm kind of with you on that one.
So as hunters, I think there's 2 talents that get a lot of emotional responses that we either really enjoy from kind of a RP stance. Even the hardcore raiders have a little bit of RPG in them, and that would be the lone wolf versus focusing shot in our whatever talent tier 100. In lone wolf, you have to lose your pet, which is a whole new ball game in Legion. But for at least when it was introduced, losing your pet as a hunter seems like a huge deal. And then focusing shot being your only other viable alternative in that tier has this huge movement penalty. You can't move for 3 seconds every, 6 or 7 seconds that you need to use it. And so I think that's the one where we get people who enjoy a talent over another. I don't know, Dark Brew, you might have some opinions if there's some other tiers where it's about enjoyment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great one too. And I mean, I use Lone Wolf only, and I partly fall into that category, not because I necessarily enjoy it, but it just seems to be, the way to go. But my preference would probably be would be to use focusing shot. I actually like that ability, and I think it fits in well with the whole sniper training. I mean, yes, you can't move it, and you can't use that ability unless you're standing still. But we're encouraged to stand still as marksmanship for sniper training, so it kind of aids you in that regard as well. But I just sort of default to Lone Wolf.
Yeah, and these are actually pretty interesting talents from kind of the work you were doing, V, with so Lone Wolf in a hectic, lots of ads type fight like we see in almost every boss in Hellfire Citadel. Lone Wolf comes out way on top because you get all these extra kill shots, our execute mechanic.
Right.
We get that when it gives 30% more to that, and once you can get more of those, it just becomes an amazing ability. So when you're getting lots of ads coming in, especially high priority target ads, Lone Wolf is just tons of DPS toward that priority target.
That's true too. And as hunters, we do this. I'll catch myself doing this sometimes, especially a big ad fight. You start looking for the lowest health ads, right? Just so you can pop the kill shot. Or you either look for the highest ones where you can get take advantage of the crit bonus from your aim shots and everything while it's at high health, and then you look for the lowest ones to get in those extra kill shots.
Yeah, and so then focusing shot actually in patchwork type fights, if you do any simulations with SimC, until you get to the most ridiculously perfect gear, which is just right now because of the way the ring's scaled, things get wonky at the very top. But in pretty much any gear you're going to be progressing in, focusing shot comes out about 1% higher in patchwork type fights, which kind of leads to this idea, maybe focusing shot isn't so bad. But then you don't actually have any patchwork fights. We don't have any chances to really take advantage of it. So it's this odd situation where there's this emotional tie to having your pet or not having your pet, depending on the hunter. And also this weird math problem of figuring out which fights can do which.
Right, and that's one of the things I started looking at. Talents can be a little tougher because it depends on how they're tracked, but with trinkets, I did a bunch of research. You've got the simulations that say here's how the trinkets should come out, but then you have logs of how they're actually coming out. And so I was able to look at a whole bunch of trinkets on actual data for single target, multi-target fights, and do like a whole analysis on it, just because we have all that data from the combat logs, right? That we can aggregate from our website. And that ends up coming out really interesting. And I feel like, if we could do something similar for talents where you compare it to the simulations, that would be really cool.
Yeah, so that brings up a topic that I was hoping we could talk about. There is a hunter theory crafter. I'm not sure if you would have interacted with him. He's from Denmark, I believe. So doesn't do tons, but he's probably he writes a Hunter guide for progression mythic raiding. Not really for any, he doesn't touch on any other types of huntering at the moment. But he, as far as I know, was the first hunter to start talking about not just overall DPS, but doing the kind of correct DPS, which is, we were talking about priority ads. So as a marksmanship hunter, if the best thing I can do for a raid is take down the priority ad from 100 to 0 as quickly as possible. And so you're saying, RPPM trinkets generally give you the highest DPS overall, but might not be proccing when that ad comes out. So you're talking, right? The traditional, I think the traditional mindset has been RPPM trinkets have been the best. And why would you ever take something like, right now we have Fellspring Coil, because it's going to do lower DPS, but it's always available. It's always there when you need it.
When you need it, right?
Exactly on that ad.
Yeah,
so
and what's funny is we hit two kinds of theory crafters. Some like only recommend on use because then you can control it and time it up with everything. And then other people like only recommend, the RPPM or things with the highest DPS. And what we really want to push with theory crafting, and things on our website is like what you just said, right? It's like, well, if you guys, for certain boss fights, you really do want something probably that has the most DPS. But then there's other things where it's like, if you're not killing these ads and these ads end up wiping your raid, you know what? You probably want the one you can control that has maybe a higher burst but lower overall, because if that's where your problem spot is, right? That's what you're going to end up wanting to use if you're trying to optimize the raid and get that kill.
Yeah, I don't know if we've ever had as many fights in a tier that required bursting priority ads as HFC. I can't think of any tier that's been like this. This is very strange. I don't know if this is just the direction Blizzard is going, but yeah, it seems like crucial right now.
I agree.
The only mechanic.
So at least for looking at hunters then, so where does that put the talisman of the master tracker? That's the Archimond trinket, where the bonus for it's spec specific. So for marksmanship, it doesn't seem all that great. You do increased damage with your shots. The further you are away from the target, basically. So does that then sort of bump it up for those high priority targets?
Yeah, I mean, and then that's where you get to, it depends on what your raid leader will allow you to do. There aren't very many fights in HFC where you can stand beyond 40 yards with our sniper training and keep up sniper training. If it goes down, then you have to move forward and can't do anything until then. So it doesn't, I think the number most people were throwing out was 35 yards. If you're 35 yards or further away, then it's a good trinket. If you're closer, then it's worse than the other trinkets available. But yeah, and that's probably a question Mythic Raiders have to be asking themselves is how can I take advantage of this trinket or of an RPPM trinket? A sensor is the one we've got right now. Or what's the spinning blades one? I can't remember what it's called. I have it right now. Yeah,
that's the on-use trinket, which is pretty nice. And then the malicious sensor is another one that we get in the Fellspring Coil. I think those are our trinkets right now.
Nice.
I think the Fellspring Coil is just that's just pure stats. Doesn't really do anything.
But a little extra boost of stats. Over the normal eye level, that is.
Yeah, so one of the things we were trying to do with some of these articles, and the next one I'm going to write, we'll be talking about like what other people have said. I think there's been like about a dozen different blog posts in response to this. It's kind of like, as a community, you guys talk about a ton of hunter topics, and a lot of people write guides and make tools. Is like, can we try to figure out a way to solve this, right? And is solving it just providing people with some data? Is that data too hard to get for people right now. Like, if you're doing SimC stuff, how hard is it to gather all of that and add that to guides, and just kind of things like trying to figure out like how we can all work together and make sure we have the right tools and data analysis to give this data to people so that people don't feel forced to switch to a talent,
right, or a spec
for no good reason, right? Like if it's doing 20% more damage, that feels like a kind of a good reason. If it's doing 1% more damage, okay, come on, that's not why we're wiping. Right? Or a whole spec, especially with the tri-spec coming up and the whole melee hunter. Are there going to be fights where you have to go melee hunter, or are there going to be very few fights where you even should be melee hunter and people are going to feel forced out of that spec? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think this isn't new to certainly Warlords or the Draenor, and this has sort of been it's very much a social issue that's just sort of existed in World of Warcraft since, I don't know, back when we found ways to start, assigning people a number, if you will, to kind of measure where they are. And I don't know how we can sort of re-socialize people in a way to start thinking. I mean, on the one hand, the idea of a cookie cutter build it's helpful, especially if you're just switching over to a new class or even to try out a new spec. You've got something that is sort of like tried and tested. For the most part, mathematically, it's pretty strong, and that you're not really making a wrong choice by taking that cookie cutter build. But on the other hand, people also use it. That also comprises like the bulk of their knowledge about a particular class or spec, to the point where they say, if you aren't, following this exactly, well, then you're completely doing it wrong, to the point where they won't bring you along, either kick you out of a raid or let you do content.
I think that's definitely a big part of it, is if you plug in with these talents chosen, or this piece of gear with certain stats, are you going to get kicked because you're wrong? Yeah. And where we find a balance of that. There certainly are, at least for hunters, there are definitely wrong choices. There are things you could choose that will make you terrible, and no amount of play is going to make up for it.
Right.
Unless, on a mythic level, at least, if you're
we talk about the current state of survival as a spec. I don't think there's much. It's just not worth taking at the highest levels of the game right now for that particular content. But
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, but we don't just have one level of difficulty in the game nowadays. There's mythic, which is like the ultimate, but then there's normal and LFR, and there's probably difficulty levels, at least with rating, where you probably could take survival and have fun, and it's not going to matter. It's not going to influence the outcome one way or the other, especially something like LFR. You're probably going to succeed, or it's not going to be the reason why you fail for some reason,
Right.
So
or for bosses that are on farm, go ahead, have fun on survival.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I was gonna say, one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten on these articles, especially from guide writers, and it's a very good concern, is they're like, well, I don't want to overwhelm people with just a ton of data and a wall of text, because we all have been to the wall of text and we all leave, right? And so like I'm not helping people, right, if there's a wall of text and everybody leaves. And we're asking a lot out of these guide writers, right? And theory crafters. We're asking that they're really good at math, that they're really good at using these tools, that they're also really good at explaining things, and that they're also good at writing. That's a lot to ask, right? So, I'm wondering if we can, help them a little bit by looking at some good examples. And Sunnier Brew, who does Brewmaster stuff, she's at sunnier'sartofwar.com, actually has a really nice way of doing it. Like she only uses words when she needs to. She doesn't put things in that don't matter. And then she kind of assesses each thing. For example, on the tier 15 or tier 1 to tier 15 movement block for Brewmaster monks. I don't really know much about these guys, but she'll say, like, for the first talent, she's like, this is the easiest and situationally powerful. And then like one sentence after that. And then the next one, she says, this is most useful on average and it has the most utility for the group. And then the last one, she says, is most useful for leveling. So I feel like if we could start to do things like that, because then you can say, like like you were talking about some of these talents or even trinkets, right? You can analyze trinkets and say, this is actually great for bursting ads. This one's great for this, and keep it super short to the point so that you don't have a wall of text. And I feel like that could be a step in the right direction. And I can link this for people in the chat room too. Oh, there you go. You've got it. Nice. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good idea. I think that's a very smart way of doing it too. And I was just looking at some of the charts and the feedback you got from the surveys and the polls that you had done. I was thinking about where you saw the one where you see like 97% of top players choose this talent, but as you say, there are another 3% of top players
who did it.
Using something else, and those are the people you really want to talk to and find out. And
right. And are they the trendsetters? Are they the thinkers? Right? Or have they figured out something that nobody else has?
Right.
Or is something else going on? But yeah, exactly like you said. Those are the people I want to talk to. Like, what are you doing that you made this work so well?
Yeah. And the other thing we try and do when we bring other hunters on here to talk about rating, and even especially at like a mythic level, we try and find out what they do on a per boss basis, because a lot of times we'll find out that they vary things up. They have different things that they'll try, whether it's a different spec, different set of talents for different situations. So they don't just have like one size fits all for them. They'll maybe change things up for a variety of reasons, just to handle specific situations on specific encounters. And that's obviously that's a cookie cutter build isn't gonna work for that. There's some thinking involved in these things.
Yeah, and I like that idea of like experimentation, right? Like I feel like a lot of times, like I like that you do that, right? Because I feel like a lot of times, if you're on a forum where you get like the mob mentality, that experimentation is not really welcomed. Like I saw somebody post something on a Reddit, and I love I love Reddit. I used to work at Dig, failed. And whoops. Somebody had posted something like, hey, I figured out something really cool. And he was super excited and posted like, some combination use between a trinket and a talent and how it was amazing. And the overwhelming response was like, this is only like a few months ago, right? So he was like, people were like, well, some theory crafter would have figured this out already if it was true. And other people were like, well, duh, that's already been talked about. Like, this guy was just super excited that he stumbled upon this himself, right? And thought he'd share it. And he just got harassed and shut down to no end. And it's those kinds of things that I want to discourage, right? Instead, encourage this experimentation like you're doing on the show, right? You have people on and you ask about these different things. And I feel like that would make the community a much happier place instead of a lot of this toxic behavior we've been seeing a lot lately.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's a weird break where you get the top 20, maybe the top 50 guilds in the world, and you see a lot of experimentation. Roger Brown from Method is on the show a lot. Maybe he's a host. I don't know at this point.
He's on so much he's earned host status.
Yeah.
Pretty much. He's welcome to join us anytime he wants. Pretty basically open invitation for him.
When every boss he's got 200 pulls on. What was Archimon? This 600, 500.
That's right. That
You've got
huge.
time to try out a lot, and he was talking about it. You have to. If you don't want to be 200 pulls in and say, "Oh, I should have tried doing this." You've got to figure it out in the first 50 pulls, maybe.
Right.
What's going to work best and what's going to happen, and you've got times to try it over and over because you're pushing in gear that is not high enough to just blow through things. But I think we have a different mindset in the next several hundred. These are people who are killing mythic bosses but not racing for any kind of world first or anything.
Right.
And they're basically have good gear before they're killing anything. And there it's like, you've got to do it right. We don't want to take 50 pulls. We don't want to take 200 pulls, certainly.
Right. If we don't do it in 10, we're really annoyed. Right.
And so yeah, I don't know what would be the right answer for that type of guild.
Right.
Where they're expecting you to do it correctly before you've ever tried the boss.
Right. And is there then another step? Like my team, I feel like we're, casual. We want to be hardcore, but life happens. And so we're a big heroic, like we're not leading the pack on heroic, but we're towards the front end of heroic, not mythic. But I wonder if there's like, yeah, another group that's like a little more casual that allows experimentation and is the, this people in that middle tier that you just mentioned, right? The second to the world firsts. Are those the kind of people that are telling everyone, no, this is how it has to be done? Like, are those the loud voices? Because, I'm, as a regular raider, our team is definitely not the loud voices. We're not leading the pack. We haven't earned that respect, right? To be able to be like, well, I know what I'm talking about. But if you're killing all these mythic bosses, you have earned that respect. So what you say goes. And so, yeah, maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, I was just looking at something in the chat room. Someone's in the chat room saying, "How can you do it correctly if you've never done it before?" Sort of. I like that question. I mean, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, although that sort of goes into just sort of overall raid strategies. And I see this with the group I kind of run with, and that's what I mean, there are videos and there are strategies that show you how to do it, but really they're what I always view them as they're called guides for a reason. I mean, they're just that. It's a way of getting it done. It's not necessarily the way.
Right, but a lot of
getting
people take that as like the gospel of how it has to be done.
Right.
Yeah, we actually used to run when Karazhan, is that the little castle-y?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's
okay, yeah. So
everyone's favorite raid.
Right back in the day, we used to do blind runs, and we would tell people you can't look up the strategy. And so we would do entire raids, blind runs. And I remember that, the librarian room where they had the ring of fire. And if you stepped outside the ring of fire, you blew everybody up. Mm-hmm. Well, everybody knows you have to get out of fire. So we would try to run out of the fire and we'd blow everybody up. And we kept, getting mad at each other, like, you're not running out fast enough. And so people started like blinking out and sprinting out, and our tries were getting worse and worse and worse. We're like, come on, people, like, get your act together. So one of the guys, like, out of defiance, who'd been blinking out of it, he's like, you know what? I'm not moving out of this thing. Screw you guys getting mad at me. And he didn't move, and we're like, that's how, and it was fun, right? Yeah. But now we've tried. You cannot get a raid team to not look up strategies. Right. Or, we'll run a raid, and, if we're doing like a slightly different strategy because of our team's weaknesses and strengths, you still get a handful of people who are like, well, that's not how you do it. Like, well, it's just one way. So I agree. Like, even allowing for experimentation and differentiation from strategies in boss fights is a thing too.
Yeah, I always feel like you got to find the strategy that works for your group and your team of people, not what everybody else. And even if it's what you're doing isn't necessarily best practice, so to speak, or it's not the most efficient way to do something, you just have to find what your group is comfortable with and what's going to work for you. And I've seen it too, where we've had people in the group who've, been successful, running the content on another tune, with another group, and they'll ignore the strategy that we're trying to do, and they'll do what they know works kind of for them. And it's just very counterproductive, right? Because, you're sort of zigging and they're zagging, by the way, and you're, right. And they're not telling you're going to do that. And then they get mad when you sort of point them out and say, well, tell them you're doing it wrong. And then, you get this back and forth. I find that to be frustrating.
Yep.
At times, but I always feel like, hey, whatever works for your team to get the boss killed and get it on farm is really what you need to figure out.
Right.
And that goes true with, finding a particular talent, particular ability, maybe that's going to benefit the group in some way that, you may not have thought of. And, that's why I think a little bit of experimentation at times can be helpful. There's a lot of utility and things like that, can come into play that, you aren't necessarily going to think about or focus on with like a cookie cutter build or a cookie cutter strategy.
Yeah, I was wondering if that could be the next test in your polling, is if this applies the same way to strategy guides.
Sure, that'd actually be a fun one to run. I should do that. Yeah, and I think like our community being so developed is good and bad, right? I mean, we have guides out for these things before the content even hits. Right? So everyone, like, we have these great resources that other games don't have, right? You know, when content comes out, usually you have a couple of weeks to do something before a good guide comes out. And with Warcraft, there's probably like what, 5 to 10 guides per boss before all the content comes out.
Yeah, I mean, there's already guides up for Legion stuff.
Oh yeah, that's right. I've seen videos and things coming out of there already, right?
What's the Ursoc has a guide up. There's all sorts of stuff already.
Which is cool, but at the same time, then is that what's really driving this there's one right way to do it kind of mentality, right? Because we have all these great resources. You don't have to learn anything on your own.
Yeah, there are a couple experiences that I thought were just amazing of the last expansion. And one was in PTR and one was on the beta, unfortunately for most people. But when Muffinus, the god developer of all Blizzard developers, at least for hunters, was he announced, hey, there's this creature out there that you guys haven't found yet. And so it turned out there was a tameable pet that no one had found yet. This was just couple weeks before Tana, what was that, 6.2 came out?
Yeah, 6.2. Yep.
And we hadn't found a pet yet, which was amazing. And so everybody, all of a sudden, there's 50,000 hunters on the PTR just looking for it. And kind of the same thing happened in the the beta, where Gara, which is our spirit beast.
Gara, yeah.
Yeah, Gara, and nobody had figured out how to do it yet. And so there were just, all this stuff doing, and we couldn't use a guide to find it. There was just because nobody had found it yet. The devs weren't going to tell us before it came out. And it was so much fun, and everybody working together. And there was certainly a lot of people were looking to my brain's not working at the moment. What do you call the data mining?
The data.
Oh, yes.
But even with that, it was still hard to figure out.
I don't think we would have figured it out very easily, or if at all, without the data mining. I mean, the data mining, and it didn't give it away immediately, but it was pretty much crucial to figuring it out. But it was this wonderful,
and even with that,
collaborative effort. And
that
was like,
fun.
And it was the kind of thing where you wish, hey, there is something to be said about just throwing something like that out there, maybe hinting at it that it exists, but not really putting it out on the beta or the PTR or something, and just pushing something like that live and letting the players figure it out as a community in the live game. Because I know there were a lot of hunters that feel like they had missed out on that, who weren't in the beta at the time, and didn't get to really participate in that. And it was just a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I also wonder if, we're talking about how this expansion, there's just been a whole lot of, you have to focus the ads down in these fights, right? Like these mechanics. Yeah. And I have been wondering, if there's so many guides out there, does Blizzard feel like they have to make more and more complicated fights? Because if there's all these guides and the fight's not complicated, you're like, oh, this fight's too easy.
And it's not just the guides, it's the add-ons as well. It's those
those seriously
that call out things. There's a lot of the deadly boss mods and the big wigs, which I use, even have audio calling out of the ability to,
right.
those, whatever the ability is, and you'll hear a voice, and it's almost like, it's as close to like a raid leader calling something out for you, which helps tremendously. So those things make it a lot easier. So I think that's a big driver right there as to why they probably have the complexity that they do.
I don't know how many guilds are doing this, but Exorcist, I don't know if I'm saying their raid name correctly. The raid team, a good team, put out a boss mod add-on this. I have no idea how long they've done it, but it's very popular right now. And a lot of Mythic teams, you can't raid without it. And so I don't know how many of you guys have done Cormrock on Mythic. You have to get in these swirlies that are all over the place. And so instead of knowing which one you're supposed to go to, the raid leader assigns it on the add-on, and it gives you a little arrow that points you exactly to where you have to stand. And it basically does the fight for you.
It does the fight for you, no kidding.
It's like that Iskar assist add-on too, which doesn't off the ball for you. But it makes it
Right.
pretty easy.
Right. Or doesn't it target? I never used it because I was like, no, I can do this myself. But
Right, it doesn't
It's-
target. It's basically like you have a mouse over add-on for it.
But I was
Yeah.
also the
Or
healer,
back-
right? So I'm always staring at people's bars, and I know who has it and who needs it. Whereas I think a lot of DPSers, that's not what they do all the time. So I could see how an add-on like that would help. But I also feel like now the fights have gotten so complicated that I don't know if you could do it without a guide. Can you imagine how hard it would be to figure these things out?
But I think that's the most fun part of it. That's why I love the PTR so much. It's like figuring out how to write a guide is so much more interesting than just trying to figure out how to kill the boss.
Yeah, but I feel like you definitely need a team, like a group of people, like on a PTR, willing to do that.
Yeah, certainly.
You know, outside of that, you know, people, I think it's hard to find people who have the patience because they're like, why don't we just use a guide?
Let me ask this. I know we had a section here. We were talking a little bit about Tri-Spec coming in Legion. That was announced on the Alpha as a placeholder of 100 gold cost. We don't know what it's going to cost to just switch. But one of the things we've talked about in previous shows is the artifact weapons that are coming in Legion. And they're spec specific, and you're going to have to do a lot of work to get them and to power them up. Then I don't know. What is your thoughts on how that might impact being able to switch specs, and especially if there's when we talk about cookie cutter builds and things like that.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know how they're letting you get it and how hard it's going to be to get for your secondary specs, and how all that's going to work yet. I don't know if I haven't seen it on the beta yet. I don't know if you guys have seen it. But I feel like with the spec swapping price, that actually is interesting, right? I'm not really sure what their main motivation is for that, but I know for us, like our team, we want it to be easy for us to switch a role, right? Like from a healer to a DPSer, if you don't need that many heals for the next boss fight, right? But you have trouble with your DPS, great. And we want that to be easy. We want that to be quick. Like I wouldn't want to have to go to a trainer to do that because it's going to slow down our raid.
Right.
But spec switching from one DPS spec to another, like we've seen, some hunters do it. I know mages are a big deal for that. Warlocks, depending on the fight, like, do we feel that's important to either charge people for or gate it? Like if somebody wants to optimize that way, should they be deterred a little bit? Or should we be like, whatever, if that's how you find optimizing fun, go for it. But at the same time, does that then put pressure on people where it's like, well, you might like marksman, but you can't play marksman for this fight, you're underpowered. And then you feel forced to switch, right? And that we don't want to happen. I feel like everyone probably agrees that you don't want to be forced to switch.
Right. Well,
and so what's the right way to handle that?
Yeah, I would wonder, is the answer to deter switching through a cost, or to just balance the specs better?
Well, balance the specs would be ideal, right? So that they're within, I would say 5% of each other would be acceptable for most people, not everybody, but I mean, I think that would probably be okay.
Yeah, right.
For hunters, at least, Siege of Orgrimmar was kind of the golden days of balance. It was the most balanced hunters had ever been and have ever been through the whole point of the game. I think there were definitely strong parts. Marksmanship could only really do single target. And BM was significantly better at AoE, but they were all playable. They were all something you could do and not be considered wrong. And now we don't see that really. I feel like this all throughout whatever we're in now. What's our expansion called?
Warlords of Draenor?
I
Draenor.
always have to ask that. Funny that I'm not the only one who keeps forgetting.
So all throughout Draenor, I feel like there's been a wrong spec. Maybe 2 have been viable, but it's never been as good as it was in SOO.
I don't know, like what if say you do want to deter the spec switching, will the artifact weapon powers be enough of a deterrence? Should the cost be gold, or should it be something else, right? Or not at all? I know the majority opinion seems to be right now that you shouldn't charge anything. You should let people spec swap.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like 100 gold is nothing at this point with all the
Well,
gold.
yeah,
we've got
100
for
gold
Garrison.
wouldn't be much at all. I agree. Um,
Or a reagent, whatever the other options they talked about.
but
Mhm.
BM Yeager in our chat room was saying, even about the artifact weapons, even if the catch-up mechanics were decent, to get your weapon, the relics will be the issue because that's what raises the item level. So he's suggesting that you could have all three weapons unlocked, but only one will probably be at the upgraded item level, which I think is,
Yeah, and that's been the big
big
shift for
problem.
hunters as one of the pure DPS classes. We've never had to switch weapons before, and at least as far as I can remember, there's never been a time when any stat was as good as weapon DPS. So we've never been able to take a lower item level weapon.
Oh, right. Hmm.
So if that weapon DPS is higher on one spec, even if it's worse, it might be the spec is worse for a certain fight. It might be better just because it has a higher weapon DPS.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because I don't know how they're planning on letting you get the artifact power. I don't know if they've released that yet, or I just haven't played enough on the alpha or something. But say when you kill bosses, you get, some sort of power to level up your weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you're only switching to, say, survival for 2 fights, well, you're like you say, it's going to be super slow to level up that weapon.
Right.
Unless you're then like, well, I'm going to go survival this whole raid to start to power it up. But that's kind of a fun metagame in itself, right? Ask a raid leader, hey, can I play survival this whole time so that I'm eventually stronger? But that's, that could be kind of fun in itself. Instead of just arbitrarily switching, you kind of have a goal in mind. So I wonder if
that's something we already see in the top raids, people taking suboptimal specs to gear them up throughout the beginning of a raid so that they can get the last boss faster. And maybe this is, primarily just method and whoever the Swedes are. What's Deva's raid called? Anybody in chat room? Paragon.
That's it.
So I don't know how many people outside of those main groups do that, but I wonder will we have to play suboptimal specs just to gear them for the last few bosses, or for one boss where it's crucial we can't do it.
Right.
With X.
Right. And then instead of that being fun, now you're really annoyed that you have to do that, right? Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And I wonder if they're going to start putting some stuff on the alpha to see how people end up using it. But
Yeah,
it's also
hopefully they'll
not-
do that.
yeah, it's not a total real world example because I think we start with like 5,000 gold. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
god, I have no gold.
But the challenges be because and I don't know if we've seen it as much, certainly not for hunters. But when they start to do balance and tuning, you certainly get more of that once the early part of the expansion. But I think for like 6.2, I don't think we've really seen much in the way of changes for hunters. Mid sort of patch, if you will. But that can throw things off too. I mean, that's what you worry about, right? All of a sudden you're like going to a patch into a raid tier and say marksmanship is the highest, and so you're okay with that and you're working on that, and then they nerf something and all of a sudden BM becomes your go-to, and you're like, don't have the artifact weapon to support it, and you got to
Right.
kind of feel like you're starting over again a little bit.
Right, which has happened for a lot of classes. And
And that was the curse of Heimal for hunters. Like they nerfed after the first week of heroics, right before mythics came out. They nerfed marksmanship hunters. So everybody had been gearing a certain way, and then it just, and some teams I think had been taking 3 or 4 marksmanship hunters. So maybe it was justified the nerf, but they had already, given out all that gear, and now it had been wasted.
Yeah, and in the past for hunters, that hasn't mattered as much. I mean, because for example, Mists of Pandaria, the secondary stats were pretty much even across the board. I mean, and we had reforging too, right? So you could balance them out,
Right, and there are only
if
3.
need be. Whereas now, Beast Mastery, you want haste and mastery versus crit and multi-strike for marksmanship. So it's a completely different set of secondary stats that you'd want to favor if you wanted to kind of min-max and optimize. So we were stuck carrying sort of multiple pieces of gear.
Yep.
around the tier pieces to really switch and be, feel like you're at the same level with each spec, stats wise. Skill wise, that's always another issue, right? So
Right.
well, good. Well, I think we've come up sort of the top of the hour here, so why don't we
Oh, good for us.
wrap this one up? But I really thank you for coming on and talking about these articles. It was really a pleasure. It was really a good conversation. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely
no,
look forward to the next article
Yeah,
and
thanks.
seeing what guide writers can do.
Right. Do you know when that's scheduled to?
I'm still
published,
working. I'm still working on it. Part of it is I also want to talk about like some solutions, but I'm trying to figure out if I can do that in a short enough article because I think there were about a dozen people who responded, and I want to make sure I fairly cover like all their responses. And like I said too, like just to make sure it's clear, I love guide writers. I am not criticizing them. Like I said, we put a lot of pressure on them to be good at everything in life. And people like us, like whether it's, tool makers like, SimC or, us as Ask Mr. Robot, we do things too, right? We show default stat weights, which starts to put a preference in people's heads rather than making them feel like a choice. And so we're also trying to solve this on our end for Legion. Like, what if we present you with 3 different stat weight options, kind of like that Sunnier Brew thing we looked at that said, this one's kind of like an AoE master, this one favors single target, and this one is controlled burst, right? And if we give people 3 options, then they can choose one. We're not saying one's better than the other. And so we really want to try to figure out how to solve this. So I'm going to try to see if that next article can put those 2 together or if it'll turn into a 4-part article series, but I'm going to try to be nice and succinct, like some of these guide writers actually do, so that people don't hit a wall of text on my article and leave. So we're pretty excited.
All right. Well, we look forward to seeing that, and we'll be happy to let our listeners know. Let us know when it's out, and we'll let our listeners know so that they can go check it out. And
Cool.
And we'll have to get you back on the show maybe once Legion progresses a little bit. I mean, I'm sure you'll probably have some changes to the Ask Mr. Robot site, and we'd love to talk.
will. We like to do big site redesigns with every expansion just because it's like a nice break point, right? And new things get introduced and stuff. And so we have a couple of fun features we're testing out right now. One of the things we want to do is once we rewrote the optimization algorithm last expansion to guarantee the single best solution based on your stat weights, like it can't be beat. We've tested it against millions of characters on like a brute force method on our own computers, and yeah, it can't be beat. Once we did that, we crossed this wall where people are like, oh, okay, Mr. Robot's never wrong. But assuming your stat weights, right? I mean, you have to like the stat weights first, but right now, the problem has really been trinkets because we're trying to weight the trinkets on stat weights, and we do a whole lot of. We have our own special little trinket simulator-y thing that interfaces between our site and SimC to try to figure it out. And so we'll take the trinket and say, well, if it spawns a fancy extra little pet for a hunter that probably doesn't exist, but I'm going to pretend it does. What we'll do is say, well, how much damage is that fancy new little pet doing from the trinket? And then how much, say, attack power or agility do you need to equal that amount of damage? And so then we tie that to the stat weight. So say it's 50 agility. We're like, okay, great. This is worth 50 agility. And then everything's based on your stat weights. But it's not as good as we want it to be. There's still flaws. A lot of it depends on, well, what simulation did you use? Like you said, are you using patchwork? Like these aren't real fights. And so we kind of want to figure out, and we're testing it, we think we figured out a way to really rank trinkets once and for all definitively. So we're trying to do some things like that. Like we know our weaknesses and we're always trying to improve them. So we'll have to come on and talk about some of those and do some fun theory crafting and figure some things out. And we also want to make some tools like that. Right now that's a private tool for us. What if we expose some of that to the community so they can use it and test it out, right? That means we have to put an interface on it,
right?
Which is always the hardest part, I swear. And see if we can, make that nice enough to expose it to other people to use.
Awesome.
So yeah, so we're trying to do a lot of fun things. And I don't know if people caught it, but I saw you showed it on the stream. we do a big art project where we hire artists for every expansion. And this time we hired about a dozen artists to make the artifact weapons for each spec. And so you guys showed the one that actually is finished for the Beastmaster Hunter.
Is that the
Or was
gun?
that
Yes.
Marksman?
No,
The
that's
gun? Is that
Beastmaster.
Beastmaster?
Yeah,
Okay.
Beastmaster's got the gun. Yes.
Yeah. So that one's finished. So we're pretty excited about how they're turning out. And we're going to put them as like the backgrounds on the site, and then we're going to make them available for download and stuff too, so people can love them and have them.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
on that note, you have been listening to episode 232 of the Hunting Party Podcast. I'm Dark Brew from thebrewhall.com and the Brew Hall on Twitter.
I'm Delirium from thrillofthewild.com, the Warcraft Hunters Union, and at Delirium Hunts on Twitter.
Check us out on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or add our RSS feed to your reader, and we'll have all these links available in our show notes.
If you have a question or a topic you would like us to announce on the show, email us at huntingpartypodcast@gmail.com or send us a tweet at huntingpartypod.
All right. Stay thirsty, my friends. Remember to drink your Dark Brew Lager.
Siempre prestar la emoción de lo salvaje.
For Azeroth.
Yay.
And beyond.
Life stealer, that's just the cost of being awesome sauce. I'm a dues payer, a boss slayer. I rock out with my lockout Viper to cheetah to dragon hawk. No time to waste, cause I can jump shot. BM, MM, and SB. I can rock out any tree. Never worried about my threat, cause I've got FD and misdirect. Catching loose mobs in my traps. I never miss, cause I am hit capped. Cause I'm the hunter, not the marked. I'm the fighter, not the spark. I'm the kiter, not the kite. I'll top the meters every fight. Landing and cave dealing death. Just me, my gun, and my trusty bed. Now let's begin with Illidan, Osirian, and Gil'jadan, Magdamar, Asgalor, Gruul, Cthulhu, and Razorgore, Onyxia to Ragnaros. Which one have we killed the most? Kel'Thuzad to Malygos. We even killed a Kama's ghost. Feels like we're getting close, all that running as a ghost. Anubarak, Yogg-Saron, Therian, Sartharian, Nycthuradon, Sapuron, Luciferon to Sulfuron,